This video is going to show you how to replace the bearings and the tail blade grips and the tail case in your Align T-Rex 450. Now what I've got here is a Pro version that has a torque tube driven system, and then an old tail case from a T-Rex 450 Sport that's a belt driven system. In both cases the bearings are the same size and the procedure is very similar. The only difference is on an old 450 Pro you're going to have to remove the tail case to pull the belt off before you can get it off the boom. But for the purposes of this video, what I want to do is show you on the T-Rex 450 Pro. Now often after a crash people are going to replace broken tail blades, bent output shafts, stripped torque tube gears and all that stuff that is very obviously damaged in a crash. But what you want to do is get into the habit of checking all your bearings and making sure that they're not damaged as well. A bearing that has internal damage might look okay, but upon closer inspection, when you spin that thing, you're going to notice some notchiness, and those bearings can cause some tail performance issues, and your helicopter's not going to fly to its optimal performance. You're also going to run into the possibility of a catastrophic failure in flight if you've got a damaged bearing that's going to completely disintegrate in flight. So what you want to do is get into the habit of checking all your bearings after a crash, making sure there's no notchiness and they're rolling very smoothly. And then also, in my experience, some of the stock bearings in a Align kit can fail without any kind of crash just because the high RPMs and the force that's exerted on them in a tail sometimes cause those to fail. So what I've got here is a new set of bearings from Boca Bearings. The good folks over there sent me this upgrade kit to show you how to replace the bearings in your tail. These bearings are specifically designed for higher RPMs, higher temperatures, and they tend to generally hold up much better than any kind of stock bearing that you got. For this installation, what you're going to need, the tools you're going to need for this, you're going to need some ball link pliers, a small Phillips head screwdriver, and this is the one right from the helicopter kit. A 1.5 millimeter hex driver, a pair of pliers, some kind of heat source if your bearings have been installed with some sort of retaining compound. Some people use just a common lighter like this, others will use a torch that you can get from any hardware store. Other folks will put their blade grips and their metal parts in the oven at about 250 degrees for 10 or 15 minutes, and what that does is break the bond between your bearings and any retaining compound that was used during the installation. You're going to need some thread lock. Most people use the blue thread lock for this type of application on a smaller helicopter, and then you're going to need your new bearings here. So the first thing you need to do if you're going to replace the bearings in your tail case and your tail blade grips is to remove the tail linkage rod with your ball link pliers. Just pops off like that. Then you're going to use your 1.5 millimeter hex driver and remove the vertical tail fin. Now once you've got these two screws off on a torque tube driven system, the whole tail assembly should slide right off of the tail boom. Just like that. Now again, if you have a sport version, you're going to have to pull the tail case apart and remove the belt before your tail assembly will come off. But with the torque tube driven system, you've got this assembly off very easily. Next thing you're going to want to do is use your small Phillips head screwdriver and remove your tail blades. And then you're going to want to remove one of these two linkages between the pitch slider and the tail blade grips. I prefer to take off the screw that attaches this linkage here to the actual tail blade grip. And again, that's with your small screwdriver. When you take this off, be careful to retain this brass bushing here on that screw. And once you get those off, you can use your 1.5 millimeter hex driver to remove the screw that holds your tail blade grip to the tail hub. Now when that comes out, you're going to want to examine the washer on the end of that screw to make sure there's not any kind of cupping or deformation. You see that very, very small washer there. Now what you can do, you'll notice my bearings came right out. There's the internal bearing that is closest to the hub, and there's a smaller bearing that's closest to the tail blade. You're going to want to remove those two bearings, and those are the ones you're going to be replacing with your upgraded bearings. Okay, so now I've removed both of my tail blade grips, and I've removed the old bearings. Again, there's two different size bearings in these blade grips. The larger goes closest to the hub, the smaller goes closer to the actual tail blade. So you're going to take your new bearings and install them into the recesses there. Now, it's your choice whether you want to use some sort of retaining compound to put these bearings back in. I personally don't, because this whole assembly is going to go together and there's no chance of these bearings getting displaced once you get the whole thing together again. And it makes it easier to replace these bearings later on. So again, the larger bearing goes towards the hub. The smaller bearing is going to go closest to the blade grip. And what I like to do is use my hex driver here and gently guide that down into position so that it seats nice and flush. Okay, once you get those two bearings back in, you can put those back on the tail hub, and you're going to want to use a very, very small amount of your thread lock to put those screws back in through your tail blade grip into the hub. Okay, so once you've got those both assembled, reassembled with the new bearings, you can move on to replacing the two bearings inside the tail case itself that sit on either end of the output shaft. Okay, in order to get to the three screws that hold your tail case together, I've found it necessary that you're going to have to take off the arm here with your small screwdriver. Pull this off. Now be very careful, because there's a small washer on this side of the screw and on the other side of the screw. Once that's off, you have easy access to the three screws on your tail case. You're going to pull those three screws out with your 1.5mm hex driver. You're also going to want to take off your tail hub, and now that is kept in place by a grub screw right there, which is also a 1.5mm screw. You can loosen that and leave it on the hub. That should slide off easily. Then your whole pitch slider assembly will come off. Then once you've got those screws out, your tail case assembly should come apart. Just like that. Now you notice this bearing came off fairly easily, and again, if you've got this right from the factory, sometimes these bearings can be put into the tail case with some sort of retaining compound. What you're going to want to do is heat that up with either a lighter, a small torch, and again put it into the oven at 250 degrees for 10 minutes or so, and it should break the bond between that retaining compound. But in this case, this bearing goes in this side of the tail hub. There's three more screws on the other side. Once that comes apart, your output shaft should come right off, and you've got access to this other bearing. Now you can try and use your hex driver and push that bearing out, and if you're not concerned about the bearing, you can jam it out as long as you're not damaging your tail case, but those bearings should pop right out. Okay, so I have the two ends of my tail case here, and on the inside of this tail case you can take your new bearings and install those into the recesses there. And again, your choice whether you want to use some retaining compound or not, but these things sit very flush and they're not going anywhere. And once you got all 6 of your bearings in, you're ready for reinstallation. And again, any kind of metal to metal connection where you're putting a metal screw into metal, you're going to want to use a very small amount of thread lock and reinstall your tail. Now, when you're reassembling this thing and putting your tail blade grips on, what you want to do is be real careful that when you use your thread lock, you only put just a very, very small amount onto that screw. And what I like to do is roll it around and get all the excess on my finger so that there's just a little bit inside those threads. If you get a little too much thread lock in there, you run the risk of binding up your new bearings and causing problems in your tail. So just a very slight amount of thread lock on that screw. Now when you put that screw back onto the tail hub, you don't want to over tighten it. You're going to go ahead and cinch it down and just give a little bit of cinch, a little bit of pressure, and let the thread lock cure and hold that screw into place so that you're not causing too much pressure between the tail blade grip and the hub. So once you've got your tail assembly back together, you got your tail blade grips back on, you've got these linkages reassembled, and everything is spinning freely. What you want to do is kind of do a function check and make sure that that pitch slider slides nice and smoothly. If you get any kind of binding, you're going to want to go back and figure out the cause of that. Any kind of binding like that is going to cause serious performances in your flight. Once you've ensured that everything is functioning properly, simple matter of putting your tail blades back on, adjusting the tension, and getting that tail assembly back on your helicopter. Okay, so I've got my entire tail assembly put back on. I've got my tail blades put back on proper orientation. I've got my vertical tail fin at a 90-degree angle to the helicopter. I've got my tail control rod reinstalled, and we're ready to go. And again, you want to make sure that that tail moves nice and smoothly and there's no binding. And what I prefer to do is let all that thread lock that I use to reinstall my tail cure overnight, or at least for a few hours before I go and fly. So let's head out and see how this thing flies.
Okay, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video.